Hi, this is your host. We sweat when we're hot or exercising. But why? What purpose does sweating serve? And what would happen if we couldn't sweat? It turns out that sweating is crucial for life itself, and it can tell us some surprising things about our bodies and how they work. When you start to get hot, you might break into a sweat. That is, you might start to perspire. Humans have millions of sweat glands, and each one can secrete about 1 liter of sweat per day. However, in hotter environments, these glands can secrete more than 2 liters of sweat per hour. This fluid is made up mostly of water, but it also contains small amounts of sodium chloride and other substances. And once it starts pouring off of you, it evaporates into the air, which has a cooling effect. That's why people who are sweating are usually topless in those old school steamy movie scenes. If they were fully clothed, they'd just end up stewing in their own sweat. The science behind why exactly sweating cools you down is pretty complicated, but scientists generally agree that the evaporation of sweat from your skin removes heat energy from your body, which then cools you down. Sweating is actually such an effective way of keeping cool that people can actually die of hypothermia if they sweat too much in cold environments, where the air temperature is below 15 degrees Celsius. People who exercise in cold conditions without enough clothing to keep them warm have died from hypothermia caused by excessive sweating. The reason is that the evaporation of sweat lowers your core body temperature so much that it can become dangerously cold. But while sweating is critical for staying cool, it also serves another vital function. You see, sweat isn't just salty water. It also contains many different kinds of proteins and peptides, molecules with multiple amino acids bound together. These proteins and peptides vary from person to person and even from one part of the body to another. For example, the protein composition of sweat from the forehead is different from the protein composition of sweat from the palm. And although there was some debate over whether these proteins had any function at all, researchers now believe that they play a key role in protecting our bodies from harmful bacteria. Scientists think that these proteins evolved to help fight off pathogens, because our skin is more susceptible to infection when it has sweat. When you sweat, you lose water and salts through evaporation. And since the salty stuff is being evaporated away, it becomes more concentrated on the skin surface. The higher concentration of salts makes it harder for most types of bacteria to survive, helping to protect you from infection. Interestingly, though research suggests that our sweat doesn't kill all types of bacteria, scientists think this is because our ancestors evolved to sweat in a particular environment. So our sweat protects us against the bacteria found in that environment, but not necessarily others. And that's thought to be one reason why people who travel to different countries sometimes get sick. They re-expose to novel microbes they've never encountered before, because their own sweat is ineffective at killing them. Another study found that people whose sweat contained a high concentration of certain antimicrobial peptides were less likely to develop bacterial skin infections after exercising. This may seem counterintuitive since working out makes you sweat, but the study's authors proposed that those people's sweat was more effective at removing heat from their bodies than sweat with lower concentrations of antimicrobial peptides. In other words, their sweat may have protected them from infection, because it worked better at keeping them cool. And here's another strange fact about sweat. Not only does it come from all over your body, it also comes from your brain. That's right, your sweat literally drips from your head. Researchers know this because they've scanned people's brains with MRI machines while they sweat. These studies found that certain areas of the brain that regulate body temperature increase their activity when the body sweats. And these regions are active even if the sweating isn't triggered by heat. Basically, the brain is in charge of making sure you sweat no matter what's causing the sweating. Some researchers think that sweating may also help your brain function. One team of scientists proposed that when you get hot, the blood vessels near your skin expand, which reduces the amount of blood flowing to your brain. Less blood flow to the brain could mean that fewer oxygen and nutrients get there, which probably wouldn't feel so good. So the researchers hypothesized that sweating may help maintain optimal brain function by creating a cooling sensation that tricks your brain into thinking you're getting enough blood flow. In support of this idea, one study found that people who exercise and sweat perform better mentally when the room temperature is raised. Another study found that when runners drank water containing salt, they performed better on a cognitive test that measured attention than when they drank just plain water. That may have been because drinking salty water prevented their brains from getting too hot, thanks to the cooling effect of sweat. But this is where things get weird. Some animals sweat and don't sweat. Fish don't sweat because they live underwater where getting hot isn't much of a problem. And birds don't sweat because their feathers prevent them from releasing the liquid. Also, mammals that live in cold environments like polar bears do sweat, because sweating would just waste precious water they couldn't afford to lose. Finally, some animals like dogs pant instead of sweating, since panting increases the rate at which they breathe. Their bodies can get rid of heat through their noses and mouths. But humans are pretty unique in that we sweat all over our bodies. And it turns out that we may have evolved to sweat all over the place, because we adapted to living in warm environments several times throughout history. Research suggests that humans first evolved the ability to sweat about 3 million years ago when they lived in Africa. At that time, our ancestors likely experienced intense bouts of heat. And interestingly, Modern humans who live in hotter climates still sweat more than people who live in cooler ones. But humans didn't stay in Africa. We spread out across the world and eventually started living in places with very different climates. For example, the ancient hominid species Homo erectus migrated out of Africa about 1.8 million years ago and into Eurasia, which has both warm and cold climates. About 500,000 years ago, Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa again and into Europe, which has even colder temperatures than Eurasia. Both times humans left Africa, they ended up in places that were significantly different from the climate they'd left behind, and both times they evolved the ability to sweat all over their body. Clearly, sweating all over the body is super useful, but scientists aren't exactly sure why that trait kept evolving in humans. Some researchers suggest that sweating may have helped early humans adapt to new environments faster than other animals did, allowing them to take advantage of opportunities that were unavailable to other species. The idea is that if you can sweat all over your body, you can adapt to different environments more quickly, and this helps you reproduce and pass on your genes more efficiently. After all, humans sweat even when we're inside buildings or driving cars, whenever we need to maintain a stable body temperature. So if sweating is so important for human health, what would happen if we couldn't sweat anymore? People who can't sweat properly are extremely vulnerable to heat stroke. Heat stroke happens when the body gets too hot because it's unable to cool itself down. When this occurs, organs begin to shut down one by one. The heart stops beating, and the lungs stop working. If untreated, death is inevitable. Some people are at increased risk of heat stroke because they can't sweat properly. People with a rare medical condition called anhidrosis literally can't sweat, and since they can't regulate their body temperature, they need to stay indoors during hot weather and avoid strenuous activities. Even then, they need to take extra precautions because heat stroke can sneak up on them. To avoid overheating, people with anhidrosis can take medication that stimulates their sweat glands or undergo surgery to transplant sweat glands onto their skin. But even if you don't have a rare condition that affects your ability to sweat, you can still sweat less than normal. People who are dehydrated or have low salt concentrations in their blood struggle to sweat, and if they don't replace the fluids they've lost, they can suffer from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Why it S? Important to drink plenty of water when it's hot outside or after exercising. Doing these things will help you sweat and keep your body temperature under control. It's unclear whether humans will ever evolve to sweat more or less. But if we do, it'll likely be in response to changes in the climate. As the average global temperature rises, humans may evolve to sweat more in order to stay cool. However, if we find a way to live and work in air-conditioned spaces, we may evolve to sweat less. In the meantime, it's a good idea to keep an eye on the weather forecast, and remember to stay hydrated. You've sweated a lot today.